Hi, everyone. We're going to get started. I'm Ethan Bueno De Mesquita. It's a matter of some debate whether I am the interim dean or the dean of the Harris School. But officially, I'm still the interim dean, so you got to give me a few months. It's great to see so many of you here today for another of the conversations that the Stone Center for Research on Wealth Inequality and Mobility, housed here at the Harris School, has been hosting. These conversations are really a model for how we can engage in conversations across difference on the most important issues facing our societies in a civil and productive way, in an evidence and analysis-based way. That's the kind of hallmark of what we're trying to do here. So it's really an honor to be here. So let me introduce our conversationalists. So, brief introductions. Steven Durlauf, my colleague here at Harris, is the Steen's Professor in Educational Policy. Steven's the director of the Stone Center, and really a pioneering scholar in so many areas that I can't really list them all. But in particular, one of our deepest thinkers about issues of inequality and social mobility, its measurement, its analysis, its causes, its policy solutions, and the like. So he is the perfect person to have here as our interlocutor for our guest, Liam Byrne, who is the Right Honorable Liam Byrne. That's a phrase I've never said before. The Right Honorable Liam Byrne served as a member of Parliament for Birmingham Hodge Hill, the most income-deprived community in Britain, for nearly 20 years. He's also the elected chair of the Global Parliamentary Network of the World Bank and International Monetary Fund and chair of the House of Commons Business and Trade Select Committee. He's the author of over 20 publications in economics, foreign policy, public service reform, and his latest book is the inspiration for today's conversation. So it's really a delight to have him here with us in Chicago. Welcome to the Keller Center. We're going to jump right in, and I think we're going to start with some remarks from each of our conversationalists, and then we'll have some questions and discussion and open it up. So it's all yours.
Ethan, thank you so much for that very generous welcome. And Stephen, thank you so much indeed for the invitation to join. As a former Fulbright scholar, I realize that I will spend the rest of my life basically saying thank you to American taxpayers for 2 fantastic years. Some of which were spent studying in Cambridge, Massachusetts, but much of which was spent growing and falling in love with the United States of America. And it's a huge pleasure for me to be here tonight to say an enormous thank you to so many people here at the University of Chicago, but in particular to Stephen for the intellectual debts that I owe. And I know those debts are only going to get greater as the evening progresses, so I'm not going to speak for very long. Westminster is full of politicians who speak endlessly. I have friends at work who I've not spoken to for days because I don't want to interrupt them. And so I'm only going to speak for about 20 minutes tonight, which, as we say in Westminster, is the average lifespan of a Conservative Prime Minister. So it's a huge honor for me to be here tonight at a campus where economists have been changing the world for a long time, in a school where your motto is not just about feeling good, but making sure that policy actually does some good. And it's a real pleasure for me to be here tonight, 5 miles from Soldiers Field, where I understand you're having a big debate about a quarterback who's coming, Caleb Williams. Have I got that right? There will be those who know more about what you call football, but we don't, who can brief me on this later. But it was 80 years ago this year that 110,000 people came together at Soldiers Field to listen to one of the greatest presidents in your history make one of the most important speeches of the 20th century. When Franklin Roosevelt came to Soldiers Field in October 1944, he unpacked an extraordinary State of the Union that he had laid out just a few months before. And he spelt out with clarity a simple truth of politics and a simple truth in economics. The well-being of the nation, he said, the well-being of the nation as a whole is synonymous with the well-being of each and every one of its citizens. And so here was a speech that explained how long-cherished American ideals of freedom would need a new foundation in the post-war world. And what was clear is that in freedom in this new world, said Roosevelt, would need a new sentinel. And that sentinel was described in one word as security, security that was to be delivered by a new economic bill of rights. And yet, here we are tonight, 80 years on from that extraordinary speech, and communities across the West, they don't feel like they're living in some Elysium of liberty. In fact, we now have a world that many of us represent in politics, where millions of our neighbors, millions of the people we came into politics to serve, feel that life is a lottery, where they live as prisoners of anxiety, trapped in a tyranny of poverty and fear and anxiety, in an economy where the strong can dictate terms to the weak, and where the rich can buy an influence at the ballot that the poor can never afford at a ballot box. So the question I want to pose tonight, 80 years on from that extraordinary speech that Roosevelt made, is how do we renew the spirit that Roosevelt gave us? And the case that I want to make tonight is very simple. It's the case that it's time for us to rediscover an old ideal, an ideal that inspired thinkers from Aristotle to Adam Smith, that inspired revolutionaries from Thomas Paine to Thomas Jefferson. My argument is simple. It's not enough for us to see the threat to freedom as the tyranny of dire states and ignore the tyranny of dire straits, the monster which is misfortune and the ogre which is private power. Like Roosevelt, I believe that there is no freedom without security. But the argument I want to make tonight is that there's no security without wealth. And that is why it is time for us to revive an old idea, the ideal of the wealth-owning democracy. Now, we have been writing books about the wealth of nations for 248 years, since this chap, Adam Smith. But you know, you were good enough to chuckle at my jokes earlier, but the funny thing is that if we went out there tonight and asked what was the wealth of my nation or your nation, very few people would know, unless we went to the Department of Economics, in which case we would get a number of different answers, none of which would be compatible with each other. But I grew up in a family that cared about these things. My parents were both 60s radicals. They went into public service because, like your ethos here at the school, they believed not just in feeling good, but doing something good. And they were the values that they gave to me. And so, as you can see, I was born 13 miles from Anfield, and I was all set for a career at Liverpool. I could have probably done something about the result we had last night. But actually, it was their influence that took me on a course into public service and into public life. But the reality is that in our country, since I was born back in 1970, our wealth has multiplied 100-fold. Those things aren't related, but we now have a wealth that is about 12 trillion pounds. And if you took that standard unit of measurement in Britain, which is the distance from John O'Groats to Land's End, basically that is enough money to pave yourself a path of gold bars, 6 bars wide, all the distance. And you here in America have had a similar experience. Your household wealth has multiplied from about $4 trillion in 1970 up to about 160 trillion today. But we all know here tonight, both you and me, the inconvenient truth. In my country, for most of my wealth, for most of my life, since those days of the little boy holding the football, the way that we shared our wealth was actually getting fairer. Wealth inequality was coming down until 2010. In 2010, things began to change. Since 2010, the wealth of the top 1% has multiplied by 31 times more than everybody else. And these are trends that are all too familiar to you in America, where issues around wealth inequality have started much, much earlier. So I think, I looked this up earlier today, I think that today you now have a situation where the top 10% holds 130 times the wealth of the bottom 50%. And these gaps, these gulfs, these differences, these inequalities are getting wider and wider and faster and faster. Now, the levels of wealth inequality are now so pronounced, they're almost Roman. So one of the favorite books I read while I was writing the book was by Walter Schneidel. And Schneidel makes the point that wealth inequality in Roman days, if you take the biggest fortunes of the richest Roman and you compare it to the average wages of a worker Roman, it's about 1.5 million times. Well, look at what's happening in Britain today. We now have a situation where the wealth of the Hindujas, the richest family in Britain, 1.3 million times the size of median wages. That's how serious wealth inequality has now become. Now, for those of you who have read Walter's book, you'll know he's not an optimist. Walter basically says, look, when you've got levels of inequality this bad, there's basically two things you can do. One is war, and the other is revolution. And, let's be honest, in our politics, both of us, we've got plenty of advocates for both of those things. But if we want to avoid a war or a revolution, can we not, as good people, come together, rebuild, refashion a coherent amity that delivers us a reformation, a different way forward? Ideas that people don't simply like on social media, but ideas that people will actually vote for at an election, like the elections that both of us are going to have this year. Because time is now running out. In fact, if we don't act now, any measure of equality that we might hope to achieve this century is about to become beyond reach, because nothing is forever, including the baby boomers. And here in America, as the baby boomers shuffle off this mortal coil, they will bequeath $70 trillion to the next generation. In my country, it'll be about £5.5 trillion. Now, of course, some will inherit fortunes, but others will inherit care bills. And so when you add in new advances in wealth management and the impact of artificial intelligence, we're about to see the fortunes of Gen Z, this remarkable storm-born generation, about to become the most unequal generation for 50 years. And that's got consequences for politics, and it's got consequences for politics and economics. But crucially, it now means that the moral emergency of the division between rich and poor will get wider and wider and wider. Now, this is the number of food parcels that have been issued in Britain. I have the most income-deprived constituency in the country. We now have food banks that run out of food regularly. I now have a member of staff who just works on food bank collection. We have people who are homeless who die on the streets of my city. That's how bad poverty has now become. And yet, if you look at those who are doing well right now, this poverty is in the midst of sales of super yachts and luxury homes and Rolls-Royce cars that have never been higher. We don't have one man, we have 3 men racing into space. This is what some call the absurdity of affluence. But the thing that worries me most as a politician, it's not the conspicuous consumption of things. It's the inconspicuous consumption of power. Because in the whole 20 years I've been in elected politics, I have never seen big money stride through the corridors of power like I see it today. And this is the problem we end up with as a result. Look around the world. Look at any country you like, where you have high levels of inequality. You have countries that are poor, which are corrupt, and which are stagnant. They're poor because actually those with a lot tend to often hide it. Think about how much money is now stashed offshore. That defunding of the state through tax avoidance or tax dodging is a significant part of why budget deficits are so great. Unequal countries become stagnant countries. Stephen's research has been fundamental in helping us understand how social mobility collapses when countries are very, very unequal. But what worries me most is the way that I now see the politics becoming more and more corrupt. And this accentuates 3 of the big problems that the neoliberals at Chicago didn't necessarily forecast. The way our economy becomes more prone to rent-seeking, the way that we now have technopolies, like oligopolies, getting bigger and bigger and bigger, the way that deregulation of financial services leads to financial bubbles which hurt the poorest much harder than the richest when they eventually burst. These are bad things for economics, but they are bad things for politics too. One of my colleagues at Nuffield College, Oxford, Ben Ansell, has done an extraordinary piece of research which sets out how those places where wealth growth did not keep pace with national averages are the places that voted for President Trump. They are the places that voted for Brexit, They are the places that voted for Le Pen in France, and they're the places that voted for the far right in Scandinavia. Wealth inequality is not simply an economic problem. It is a political problem too. And if you believe, as I do, that it's about to get much worse, we have to envisage a future where populism gets worse and where the divisiveness of today's politics gets ever harder to manage. And that's why we really are now at a fork in the road, and it's why we have to work much harder on devising solutions for change. Now, this was Tony Atkinson's great challenge. Tony Atkinson, some of you know, academic at the LSE, the mentor to Thomas Piketty, whose book is 10 years old in English this year. Atkinson said to Piketty, look, great analysis, you've shown some really important insights here, but what is it we're going to do about it? And a lot of my work in the House of Commons is trying to identify where's the overlapping consensus between the left and right. And I'm going to whip through this bit very quickly because the solutions that we've come up with in the book might work for Britain, not necessarily things that will work in America. But the framework, I suspect, is as good here as it is in the UK. It's the framework devised by James Mead. James Mead, devotee of John Maynard Keynes, invented national income accounting in the 1950s and 60s. And what he basically tells you, I won't go through, I'll spare you the equation, but what he basically tells you is if you're worried about wealth inequality, then you've got to be worried about four basic things. You've got to be worried about the income that people have, the amount of savings they can save from that income. You've got to be worried about the returns they get on that saving, and you've got to be worried about the tax that they then pay on it. And so where that takes me is to a five-point plan. Every politician loves a five-point plan. Here's mine. You've got to have growth everywhere, not just in any jobs, but in good jobs. You've got to be able to act to raise earnings. You've got to deliver what I call universal basic capital. You've got to, in countries like mine, deliver Commonwealth funds to underpin that capital, and you need a tax code that reflects your moral code. So here in the UK, it won't be dissimilar in the US. Most of our knowledge-intensive jobs are in London and the Southeast. What the book advocates is what Secretary Yellen calls a modern supply-side economics, but coupled with a radical devolution of economic power in our country. Second, we have to end the kind of race to the bottom that is written into the rules in our market system and begin harnessing. We have £2 trillion worth of pension savings in our country. At the moment, it's impossible to invest that money in a way that doesn't root money into companies that are poisoning the planet, killing their workers, dodging their taxes. And so this revolution in ESG is something that is of fundamental importance if we can couple it with pension savers' power so that you can begin investing in companies that do good rather than drive down wages. Crucially, as part of that, the book proposes a universal dividend to young people, about £10,000, to help them get onto the property ladder, paid for by a system of universal basic capital. Universal basic capital is inspired by ideas that have been commonplace in the States for a while, individual development accounts generated by US policy thinkers in the 70s, that basically links your savings account with your lifetime learning account and your auto-enrollment pension. But the key thing for the UK is actually beginning to look at the way that we route tax incentives to those who are very poor. We have about £70 billion worth of fiscal welfare that mainly goes to those who have assets. It's not organised in a progressive basis. But the key thing is then making sure that for young people, that one-off dividend is paid out of a sovereign wealth fund. It's something that about 70 to 80 countries around the world have got. It's something that we could have set up actually in the 1980s if we didn't give away all of our North Sea oil. But crucially, building a sovereign wealth fund like this, again, a little bit like Alaska, there are good models here at the state level, which we would seek to emulate. A lot of that is easier if you have a tax code that reflects your moral code. Now, it's unlikely that many people here have read Rishi Sunak's tax return. And the funny thing is that when I say this to UK audiences, none of them have read Rishi Sunak's tax return either. And it's not very long, it's a page, in fact. That's how long Rishi Sunak's tax return is. And for those of you who are very good and very quick at maths, what you'll basically see is our Prime Minister makes about $2 million in income, but he pays an average rate of tax, which is 23%. Now, at a time when 1 in 5 British taxpayers are paying 40%, this is hard to justify. But of course, like the US, what we've done in the UK is bring down taxes on investment income to such a low level that those with a lot from investment income happen to get a load of privileges from the tax system. So our investment income has grown to about 80 billion as wealth has tripled. But if you're lucky enough to be in that top 10%, about 60% of that investment income will flow to the richest, who will then pay half the rate of tax of everybody else. So it's easier to build things like a sovereign wealth fund if you've actually got a tax code that is fair and ensures that those with the broadest shoulders actually pay their fair share. So the policy agenda for you will be different to the US, to the UK. But this basic menu of creative states, a civic capitalism, universal basic capital, sovereign wealth funds, fairness in tax, I suspect that many of these components would be as important here in the US as in the UK. The final point I wanted to make then is really to end on a note of optimism, because I have Gen Z children who, when they read the kind of transcript of the book, were a little bit worried that it was going to be a slightly gloomy prognosis. And I'm an optimist. You've got to be an optimist in the Labour Party. It's the only way you get through the long periods of opposition that we're so prone to have. But the optimistic point on which the book ends is this: the next decade or two will be simply extraordinary. We live not simply in an era of change. We do now live in a change of era. The kinds of things that we will see in the next few years will bring science fiction to life in our lifetime. 90% of the scientists who have ever lived, they're working today. They're backed by nearly $2 trillion of research spending. The things that they will invent in genetic medicine or artificial intelligence or global gigabit connectivity or the shift to green energy will transform the options, the agency, the control that each of us has over our own lives. It unlocks a genuine possibility, a genuine freedom to be you. And if we want to give everybody a share of that progress, we need to think more imaginatively than even Roosevelt contemplated back in 1944. The kinds of rights that we could have in the future need to evolve as progress changes. The Magna Carta, it says a lot about the whys and wherefores of policing fish weirs. It doesn't say anything about digital literacy. If we want to enshrine people's stake in progress, we have to give them new rights, like the right to safety, the right to work, the right to live with decency, the right to nature or health or education, the right to respect, the right to participation or mobility, the right to progress and hope, the freedom to be you. But as imaginative as these rights could be, they will not be real without security. And crucially, the way that we deliver security is through wealth. And so we should think ambitiously and optimistically about the future. The future will be extraordinary, but if we want it to be a place where we all get a share, then we have to recognize, as Roosevelt once said, that true individual freedom cannot exist without economic security. And I don't believe there can be that economic security without wealth. And that is ultimately why good people on both left and right have to work a lot harder to rejuvenate an old ideal, not just a wealthy democracy, but a democracy of wealth. And that, I think, is an idea which even Roosevelt would have applauded. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, first of all, Liam, thank you so much for both the beautiful presentation and, more importantly, for the book. You don't know me that well, but the idea that I'm going to compliment a book is not my usual standard operating procedure. And so one of the things I was daunted by in discussing the book was how to take a different tack. And the most important thing to say is that, for sincerely, it's really an extraordinary achievement, and I thank you for that. Let me also thank Ethan both for doing that, and I hope it's not out of place to just thank you for becoming the full-time dean. It's in terms of wealth, a very important type of wealth increased. You talk about security, et cetera. having outstanding leadership matters, and I am grateful. Oh, figuring out how to work with it is quite different. I wanted to start off with a quotation from a book that was published in 1959 by Henry Steele Commager, who was talking about, the American mind. And he ends the book with an extraordinary, really a remarkable statement where he said that they, the Americans, had created an economy of abundance. Could they fashion a political mechanism to ensure the equitable distribution of the abundance? They had become the richest people on the globe. Would they use their wealth to prosper society or to display power? Or they were democratic in law, but would they be democratic in fact? That, to me, is very much what your book is trying to do. And unfortunately, I think that relative to what Commager said, there's reasons to be disappointed that that profound challenge was not taken up. And so the optimism that's communicated in the book and in the presentation is to say that we still can do better. So with reference to the book, again, it really is a wonderful book, and I recommend you read it. And there's two dimensions of that I would emphasize. The first is it's a lovely synthesis of empirical work on inequality and on wealth dynamics. And so, in other words, to have what the facts are, this is a place to go. And the second thing is that it has compelling portfolio of first-order policy proposals. Now, when I say it's compelling, I just mean I agree with them. What I mean is that they're policies that respect things such as budget constraints. In other words, this is not a utopian vision of suddenly societies becoming more egalitarian, but recognizing there are concrete, albeit non-incremental policies that can affect things. And so that's why the book matters for actual policy debate, because it is in the realm of the significant, the first order, I don't want to say, but not the revolutionary or the utopian. These are things that can be done. So what I want to do in these comments is a couple of things. Is number one, I'm going to actually, since he introduced an equation, this will be the first time in my life I've ever been the person who had fewer equations on a panel. I'm not going to have any, but I'm going to have some figures. What I want to do seriously is I want to put on the table that there's some conceptual ways to think about the issue that this book is trying to address. I'm going to emphasize intergenerational perspectives, and I'm going to argue that the mechanisms that Liam has identified in the book fall into certain categories. The second thing, I want to complement the book with the E by emphasizing other policy levers that I think are important. The extent to which these are idiosyncratic to America is something subject to debate, but nevertheless are things I think matter if we're talking about wealth inequality in the United States. So this is what I want to put on the table in thinking about the message of this book. And that is, it's really one more effort to understand the possibilities that there exist distributional instabilities in advanced capitalist economies. In other words, that when thinking about the evolution of the cross-sections of wealth, thinking about the evolution of mobility, et cetera, the background question is under what circumstances are there mechanisms in the society that are going to be causing self-correction? War is not a mechanism of self-correction, it's an exogenous shock. And I think that the times in which you see much of the difficult times, of course, are because of the lack of self-correcting mechanisms. And so I want to put on the table that, of course, this is of ancient lineage. You could say this is what Marx's contribution was at one, among the plethora of contributions. One fundamental idea was that there was something unstable in the distribution of wealth and income. Now, whether or not the particular story that he told was correct is not the point. It's the instability. And I want to argue there's three types of instability that are relevant in the 21st century. The first is, I want to say, under what circumstances do we have stability? And the way to think about that would be to say that there's something about wealth dynamics that on average means that those that have lower wealth are going to grow faster than those that don't. So in other words, there's some tendency for convergence across time. If you have a situation in which universal education is allowing the disadvantaged to grow faster because the affluents already had higher education, that's an example of which you have a stabilization mechanism. In other words, public education by itself can ameliorate those things. But in societies, that's not the entire story. The second idea would be the possibility that the rich are going to grow faster than the poor. And much of the discussion in the book, not much of it, some of it has to do with specifically that idea. In other words, the rates of return on investment. That's the James Meade idea that he was articulating, could be higher for the rich than the poor. And once you're in environments when that can occur, and of course that's naturally a consequence of rent seeking. Rent seeking is about zero-sum activity in which those that start off with more are able to benefit from that.
you end up with environments in which the contemporary gaps just begin to grow. I note here that there's something in the book that I thought, if anything, was underplayed. And that is, it is in growing societies that the potential for these instabilities are higher than stationary societies. It's the society in which you get financial market innovations, in which you get technology innovations, the Silicon Valley, et cetera, which are causing the scope of possibilities in the entire economy to be growing. And then if you look at the individual trajectories within it, there's simply more scope for divergence, non-convergence. Second type of instability is the case in which you actually have simply non-linearities. There's thresholds. You have to have a certain level of something in order to proceed. In a society in which poor families can't afford to send their kids to college, that creates possibly multiple steady states. Poor families can't afford to send their kids to college, the kids don't do well, it becomes self-replicating. Similarly, if you start off rich, it becomes self-replicating. Here, and I'm a little embarrassed to talk in front of him about this, I think that this is one of the places you would introduce differential political power. In other words, the implementation of policies could differentially benefit those with high and low wealth, and that could create the self-reinforcing. So there's a threshold effect that puts you into the group in which you're benefiting from the policies. But again, that's an abstract thing to say. The third thing I would say is the following, and that is, it may be that when we think about societies, we need to move from groups to individuals to groups. In other words, there just may be different income dynamics for different subsets of the population. This is the sense in which that's a natural thing for Americans to worry about. If you're asking about the inequality of the United States, it's extraordinarily difficult, be it wealth or income, education, you name it, to not talk about issues of race. And so again, that creates a different type of persistence. In other words, the groups are not converging, even though there's lots of churning within the groups. And so put differently, that says that what I would complement some of this analysis here with would be thinking about policies that focus on class and racial inequality. But once I say those things, what I've really said to you is that segregation is the key substantive mechanism that is creating persistent inequality. And once I'm focusing on groups, I have to ask questions about how to break these types of segregation. Now, do these things matter? Many dimensions of that. Here are the differences in per capita expenditures in schools between California, New York, and Texas. The point is the political economy of the United States does this. Segregation by income begets segregation in the quality of schools because of the fact that rich school districts raise much more money than poor ones. So now we have a direct idea that segregation, with economic segregation, does something. Here's a second example. Extraordinary work finding there are thousands of students who have high test scores and are from poor families that don't apply to good colleges. In other words, if you divide kids between, high school seniors between high and low income families, you find remarkable heterogeneity in their applications when all of this talent is, to be blunt, going to waste. And so that's the so-called undermatch hypothesis, again, associated with a certain identity segregation. Here's a third example. For the city of Chicago, if you divide the neighborhoods up by toxicity, which is defined as exposure to violence, incarceration rates, and exposure to lead, the majority in black and majority white neighborhoods essentially do not overlap in terms of the levels of that toxicity. And what you see there then is, of course, this is the city of Chicago, which is extremely segregated. So these are all just examples of how segregation can be, both economic and racial, become complementary mechanisms to what's talked about in the book. Now, in thinking about African Americans, I want to put the following facts on the table, just to kind of close the discussion. This is from 1962, and it looked at occupational mobility between black families and white families, and I actually saw this, I'm not making this up, when I was 15 years old. I was on the high school debate team looking for evidence, and I never forgot it. The reason is that what it said is that for African American families, this was a long time ago, it didn't matter what your parents did. You were going to be a manual worker with extremely high probability. In contrast, for white families, the probabilities are concentrated on the diagonal. That's a key point. In other words, in thinking about groups, it's not just the issues of persistence in isolation, it's the inability for upward mobility to be locked in. And in fact, there's very strong evidence that if you think about racial inequality, it's not just harder for disadvantaged black families to rise than disadvantaged white families, it's also easier for them to have declines across generations. And so I want that to give you some scope of why I focus on these issues of segregation as complementary. Let me say that once we go down those routes, and by no means do I suggest that the universal basic capital sovereign funds don't speak to distributional instability, and tax reforms almost tautologically do so, I would simply say there's additional policies I think it is important to think about. I've already mentioned educational finance reform. Another example is affirmative action. Yet another for the United States is a need for profound reform of the criminal justice system. In other words, once we're thinking about groups and different exposures, et cetera, I think that the policy sphere opens up to things that are maybe not traditionally thought as non-economic. And so, an example of that is this is the cumulated incarceration rate for African-American men. In other words, asking by the time you're 30 to 34, what's the probability you've been in jail? The numbers are simply astronomical. That is a statement about the punitive nature of the system. It's well understood that this is a fundamental source of inequality. I only put that on the table that in trying to ask about the wealth dynamics, a lot of it's got to do with who has zero wealth. This is how you produce it. Final comments I want to make is that I think it's important in thinking about the book to pull out different pieces that actually had to do with good jobs. So there's discussion of a technical university trust system that would be designed to revolutionize, I should have said hopes to revolutionize, the way that vocational education is done in the country. Another idea was how the green industrial revolution could, so to speak, create good jobs. I think that this is extremely important and actually goes beyond wealth inequality. In other words, to me, one of the great challenges in thinking about inequality is how do people have flourishing lives? That's really much of what about Liam was talking about. It wasn't just about inequality, it's about flourishing. And the challenge, I think, in our society to a large extent is to make sure that people obviously have flourishing lives. And so then the question is, how do you create jobs that they can feel they're going to find rewarding? Elizabeth Anderson, the philosopher, has written, for example, about the fact that we spend so much of our lives in essentially undemocratic environments, somebody telling us what to do all the time. And so I'm emphasizing, I think, in these types of reforms, to really focus on the notion of flourishing via jobs. And for what it's worth, in my opinion, when we talk about artificial intelligence, robotics, the effects on labor markets, a lot of the discussion is missing the point. I don't think there will be mass unemployment. I think there will be mass reduction of jobs in which people identify with what they're doing and feel that they're rewarded from it. Final comment. The book is not consistent with Oscar Wilde. And so Oscar Wilde once said there's no such thing as a moral or immoral book. Books are well written or badly written, that's all. And that's not true. This is a moral book. And why would I say that? Because I think in discussion inequality, it's a terrible mistake to sort of focus on, oh, maybe inequality is bad for growth. Of course, I think that's an important thing to say. But ultimately, what matters is the humane vision. And what this book gives you is a comprehensive, humane vision of a meritocracy worth its name. And that's why I want to print it. Thank you.
All right, thank you both. So, delighted to get to ask you some questions. I enjoyed the book. I have some thoughts. I'm not an economist by training, and so since I want to try to avoid for as long as possible any conversation about the merits of taxing wage income versus capital income and leave that to people in the audience who know way more about it, I'm going to step back and ask a little bit about philosophy to sort of tread water for a little while and see if I can burn the time. So I want to start prior to the analysis with what I think are baked-in normative assumptions that I want to try and unpack a little bit. So I just want to think a little bit about why we should care about inequality before we figure out what to do about inequality. And I think that if I think, Liam, about your book, and to some extent, Steven, I think if I think about your presentation as well, there are a bunch of different stories going on all at once. And so I want to unpack them, and it's a perfectly fair answer to say yes and, but I want to get a sense of your thinking, because I do think which reasons we care about inequality should probably affect which policy solutions we like, which diagnoses we care more or less about. So just a few kinds of stories or threads that I see in the book in terms of accounts of why I might think of inequality as a problem. Here's three, and I think there's probably more, but here's three. One is what we might think of as some notion of fairness. So, whatever, if we were thinking about it like philosophers, we might think about luck elimination. We might think that A lot of the things which are associated with great wealth or great poverty come from luck, not from merit, that they have to do with who your parents were or what country you were born in or other facets of luck. Where luck ends and merit starts is a deep question, I don't know. But there's some things that seem like obviously luck, and it might just strike us as unjust that our life outcomes are so driven by luck, and we might want to live in a society where luck matters less. So that's one sort of thing I see in the book. Another kind of thing that I see in the book, and I think it comes out in some ways in your discussion of Roosevelt as well, is more of a utilitarian notion about what is good for society, that inequality is either growth reducing or that the poor value money more than the rich for kind of marginal utility reasons, and so redistribution away from vast inequality is just kind of good for the welfare of society broadly construed. That's a different kind of account, I think, than a fairness kind of account, but it's, I think, another reasonable account. And then the third one I see very clearly in the book and I think is important, and in some ways I want to know, is the third one fundamental, or is it only as it reinforces these other ones, is something to do with politics and democracy, which is to say that maybe it is just the case that large amounts of inequality of wealth or of income are corrosive to democracy in various ways, that they undermine a sense of representation, that they encourage rent-seeking and corruption, et cetera, and that living in a properly functioning democracy is in and of itself of value to people. And we ought to, even if these other two things weren't true, we ought to dislike inequality primarily because it is corrosive of our politics. So I don't know. Let me throw that out to the two of you. And
Yeah. Should I start? Yeah. So the book is written in an effort of persuasion, I suppose, and it's got to take account of a public space where there are different conceptions of fairness. So for those of us on the left, John Rawls probably still had amongst the last words, and so we do see justice as fairness, and when we look, I suppose, at what's happened over the last 10 to 15 years, there are all kinds of unfairnesses which we would say are unwarranted. So by far and away, the biggest one has been triggered by quantitative easing. So in our country, we've had about £1 trillion worth of quantitative easing. That's probably knocked about 1% off interest rates. That's probably delivered about 4/5 of the growth in wealth that we've seen in the last 10 to 15 years. And so if you began life at the beginning of the financial crisis with assets, you've had a fantastic decade, frankly. Did you do anything to deserve that windfall? Arguably not. And so there is a kind of unfairness there that I think does light up a question of justice that for those on the left is easy to answer. But I've got to accept that I'm in the persuasion business, I'm trying to win elections, and therefore I've got to appeal to a public space where there will be others that have much more merit-based views about fairness. And so one of the ideas, I suppose, that influenced me most was the Rawls idea of the overlapping consensus. Where can we try and find an overlapping consensus between left and right about a way of more fairly sharing the future? And I suppose that's why the book probably does tend towards a more instrumental argument about how do we deliver growth more fairly in the future, because that is probably instrumentally good for everybody. We have a division that has now become clearer in British public life, which is between what we call the structuralists, those who believe that inequality is created by structural problems in society, and those who take an individualist account, those who just think it's all down to lick, spit, and elbow grease and a bit more hard work. And the question is, how can we find some common ground between them? And I suppose that's what the book tries to do by saying, look, ultimately, if you want to live in a country that is free, you've got to acknowledge that some of that freedom indeed comes from your independence. But for freedom to be real, you need a security that comes from our interdependence. And if you want to sustain interdependence and the politics of cooperation, then you need to have a conversation about how you share the prize. And it's, if you like, a slightly different tradition from American conceptions of freedom in the last 2 centuries. So I kind of contrast the European and the American by posing it as the freedom of the frontier has always been a predominant cultural motif in the freedom debate in America. Actually, in Europe, it's the freedom of the city, historically, that was meaningful. one is about independence, one's about interdependence, but the truth is, to be truly free, you probably need both. And so that's what the book is trying to do, I suppose, in kind of trying to square the circle by leaning into an instrumental argument about how fairness is good for all, safe in the knowledge that the arguments I have in the Labour Party would be rehearsed in a slightly different way.
It's worth noting that right up until a minute ago, we thought of that as the Anglo-American notion of freedom.
Well, I think that part of what's important in this discussion is the creation of consensus, and what that implies is there's going to be multiple ways to think about the justifications, and by all means they ought to be argued, because people are going to legitimately disagree on the philosophical perspectives. And what I mean by that is, speaking for myself, you asked what the priorities are. The first one in my head is rectification of injustices. And so the reason that when I give a presentation like this, I spend so much time on racial inequality is that there's a thing that's sitting there which is an incomprehensibly horrible history that I think of as be prioritized in terms of what has to be addressed. Once one goes beyond that, and that's really not about the ideal theory, of course, that's the non-ideal, what do you do in response? I'm personally generally moved by fairness considerations. And so if we go down that route, thinking about the extent to which people get what they deserve, I think pushes us a long way. Now, from that perspective, I think, again, that leads to this idea that accidents at birth, so somehow the consequences should be minimized. You don't eliminate them, since we don't want to interfere with the investments that we make as parents in reading to their children. What we do instead is quite different than saying that if you live in Beverly Hills, you get to go to a better school. And so I put that as, giving that a very substantial priority, in other words, in trying to identify these places where there's a consensus that there's something unfair about the disparities that are being generated. But I certainly wouldn't go, make an argument that's sufficient. One of the problems with luck egalitarianism is there's something puritanical about it. In other words, everything I'm responsible for, it's okay. And that is not a very merciful position. And so I think that's the way I think I would articulate the limits there. Let me add one more point, which is that in terms of thinking about people getting what they deserve, that strikes me as an important thing to link the political and economic spheres. In other words, here's a hypothetical which exists on some planet, not ours. Suppose they actually were independent. One would have a different view of inequality than we have in a case where they're dependent, because our beliefs about what is the intrinsic demands for equality as citizens are different than they are as workers. And so I think the point you brought up about their interaction actually is first order. And so if you ask me on the rectification, again, my list of things that are a disaster is terrible in the United States. I would have added the undue influence of the very rich on, right now, the flow of information.
Interesting. All right, so I want to think for a moment about why we're talking about wealth inequality. So if one spends a little bit of time with the economics literature on inequality, one finds most of the discussion to be about income inequality, and you very consciously move to wealth and make an argument on its behalf, which you didn't have time to sort of get into. But I think it's worth spending a little bit of time on, is wealth inequality, which I think is, I guess, probably the harder problem than income inequality, and the slower moving set of solutions than you might think about policy interventions on the income side than on the wealth side. Is that really the right place to be working, or is the pragmatic move to really be focused on income inequality? Or another way of saying it is, why wealth inequality?
Yeah, indeed. So I very much began with a focus on income inequality, and that story began here actually with Jared Bernstein, who was then chief economic advisor to then Vice President Biden. And the vice president had then set up the middle class task force. I was visiting from the UK Treasury and felt that the analysis sounded pretty familiar to things I felt were going on in the UK. When I got home, we set up a team at the Treasury to understand the problem. And sure enough, we understood for the first time that we had a significant problem in income inequality that was of fundamental importance to Labour's defeat in 2010. And we picked it up too late to do anything about it. But I became increasingly convinced that wealth inequality was the key argument for two reasons. So one is the political effect. So it's become clearer, I think, to many political scientists now that it is it's the levels of wealth inequality that are principally responsible for driving the wave of populism that we see today, rather than income inequality. And Stephen is right to say you can think about wealth in a rounder way than simply material wealth. You can, and I think about human capital, social capital, capital, and also pension capital. And people feel that, many people in those places that are left behind feel that their wealth has just not kept pace with others in society. And that is fostering a resentment that is so powerful, it's beginning to ferment an acid that is about to melt the joints of nations if we're not careful. It is, because remember, the opposite of populism is separatism. When people see populists prevail, actually what they seek to do is to take their states, their bits of the country, away from those who they see as in charge. And so those kind of autonomous movements that you're seeing around the West now are becoming stronger and stronger, in part because of wealth inequality. So the political effects of that as a politician is something that I felt was super important. But second, you kind of go back to Mead and the rates of return in a way. Unless we tackle wealth inequality, it's going to get inexorably worse. It doesn't fix itself. It gets worse if left to its own devices. And we haven't got a lot of data on this globally, but some of the best data is from Norway, that shows rates of return for the richest that are 10 to 15%, when you think about rates of return for the poorest, which are basically negative because they're paying charges. So if you've got a lower savings rate and a lower rate of return and an unfair tax system, then you've just got a system that is going to develop wealth inequality sharper and sharper over the course of several years. And that is bad, because wealth always shows up in politics. It shows up in lobbying, it shows up in rent seeking, and that eventually begins to dismember good old-fashioned capitalist systems. So I guess the older I got, the more I kind of began to appreciate the intergenerational nature of the solutions that were going to be needed. But ultimately, I zeroed in on wealth inequality as the kind of the fountainhead of problems that we have today in both our markets and in our politics as well.
So I'll start by saying I think that there's some divergence in the European and the American traditions in thinking about mobility and inequality, and that there's much more interest in inheritance in the literature in Europe than, whereas Americans tend to focus on human capital. I emphasize that because I think that a derivative from that, the American focus on human capital, and this has to do with certain visions of how the United States works, does lend itself to focusing on income versus wealth. Whereas European history, Lewis Hart's, whatever the status of his book, argued the existence of an aristocracy has very deep consequences in terms of the sorts of injustices one is sensitive to, and that naturally leads to inheritance. That said, I think with respect to contemporary research, one huge difference is simply that the wealth data are so poor that the ability to do that much in terms of analysis of mechanisms is not great. And so it's not exactly the same thing as looking for the keys under the light, but you need data in order to assess theories. I think that's been a little bit of it. The second thing, which should be more principled, is that in thinking about well-being, in some sense, it's an individual's wealth that does it, because that's the full command of resources over the life course. And in that sense, I think that the focus on inequality in the intergenerational mobility literature was lacking something, because what the literature typically did was make an assumption that there's no distinction between income and wealth, and so in that sense it was a triviality. And I think that that's probably something that got missed there. And so maybe the final thing I would say is that I think there's interesting interactions between them. So let's take the fact I put on the table that affluent African-American families are more likely to exhibit downward mobility than white families. That was with respect to income. Where would that come from? One obvious explanation is wealth. And so the wealth differences mean, again, maybe think about it in a very basic fashion. If I have a successful, parents are doing very well, but there isn't that much wealth in the family, and there's going to be the resources are going to become in vivo transfers as opposed to inheritance. And so once you go down these routes, I think that helps explain some. I don't know if I explain that very clearly. It's just that the question is, what do I do with my wealth, or my income? Do I save it and hand it to my kids as a bequest, or do I do things for them in the life course, or do I disperse these to kinship networks, to friendship networks, et cetera? Once you go down these routes, you can see that the income facts may be derivative from the wealth inequality, and so that's just a mechanism you'd want to focus on.
Mm-hmm. But I think you tilt at something really important here, which is about risk and resilience. So, I mean, the other thing, I guess, that I found writing the book, and actually the precursor to this book is A History of British Capitalism, which is told through the lives of 10 of our entrepreneurs over the arc of 700 years. What you find is that where families have wealth, there is a resilience that can sustain you through the bad times as well as the good. And that shows up in your risk appetite as well. And so everybody loves a rags to riches story, and there are many here in the United States, and there are some here in the UK. But what was striking about writing a book about 700 years of British enterprise is that most of the most successful entrepreneurs, almost all of them, did not come from poor families. They came from families that were able to stake them as they made the inevitable series of errors that you need to make to become a successful entrepreneur. And so I think if we're genuinely interested in an entrepreneurial market economy where families are able to weather storms, and heaven knows we have enough of them right now, then wealth just becomes a far more important thing for public policy makers to worry about.
So I want to talk about, I had a set of, I think, in my mind, interrelated issues. I'm hoping you can help me work it out. So there's a bunch of interrelated questions I want to ask. One version of them is, why aren't you a populist? And I want to get to that through thinking about trade and industrial policy and the like as another set of policy levers that I think I thought maybe Steven would talk about. But anyway, let me give you what I take to be, if I put aside rent seeking for a moment.
Yeah.
So one source of growing inequality is perhaps political power and rent seeking and et cetera. And I want to just set that aside for a moment, although I think that's an important story, and just think about the economics. And I take there to be, if I think about things like globalization, trade, and automation, I take there to be kind of two competing stories. This is not my area, but I'll give you what I take to be two rough sketches of them. So one of them, at least in America, is that we are getting things like automation being labor replacing rather than labor complementing over the last 20, 25 years due to decisions being made by those inventing and implementing forms of automation for reasons having to do with bad policy, things like the manner in which our countries tax capital versus tax labor, that lead companies to be making sort of socially inefficient, individually rational automation decisions that are leading to lots of good jobs going away and being replaced by robots or by computers or whatever. And that we could fix that with policy levers along the lines of changing how we tax capital income versus labor. Another story I hear, and I associate that story with Doron Acemoglu and others in that sort of line of argument about directed technological change. Another kind of argument I hear is what's going on with automation, with globalization, with increased trade, et cetera, is essentially that the best firms, the firms that are most efficient at the use of capital and therefore have a lower labor share, are winning and increasingly winning. We're getting the rise of superstar firms that are capital intensive and labor non-intensive, and that is good for economic, that those are the right firms to win, right? They're using resources really well. It's good for growth. And that if we wanted to change that, we would have to do kind of not the kind of Acemoglu style, like let's use the taxes to realign incentives, but really like growth reducing industrial policy, trade policy kinds of things, and that there might be a real trade-off between inequality and growth, changing inequality and growth. So I'm interested in thinking about which of those stories strikes you as most plausible? What does that tell us about which kind of policies we should work on? And is that is your choice between those the explanation for why you're not an anti-trade populist?
Great questions. So let's take the trade question first. So David Ricardo, 1817, says a lot about the gains of trade, but actually he doesn't say very much about who gets the gains. And so, there has to be a public policy response that is not simply about growing trade in the way that we've had the hyper-globalization of the last 30, 40 years, but we coupled it with very weak mechanisms for redistributing the gains of trade. And so the book is deliberately about the redistribution package that a modern economy needs if it's to guard against the kind of inequalities that our market system is creating. And we're obviously having a big debate between UK, Europe, and America about trade policy at the moment. But actually, I've got a lot of respect for the Biden administration's focus on trade policy that actually drives up labor standards and drives down carbon content. Because actually, there's nothing in pure free trade theory that would get you to those outcomes unless you add policy to it. On technology, this is more interesting. So on technology, people forget that in Schumpeter's great book, he gives us the theory about creative destruction. But people forget the flip side of creative destruction is the destruction of competition. People are lured onto the trails of innovating by the opportunity to get innovation rents. And the problem in our market system is that we've allowed those rent seekers to gain a grip that has allowed them to build technopolies which are now unchallengeable. And so competition policy has failed quite dramatically. And in truth, it's going to be politically really difficult to begin breaking many of these companies up, which again is why I kind of resort to saying, well, look, even if we can't break these firms up, and goodness knows I know people like Lena Khan and the EU Commission are trying to do their best there, ultimately you've got to fix the redistribution thing quickly. Now, this is all about to become more important in a world where trade fragmentation and industrial policy are multiplying. So trade barriers have multiplied fivefold in the last 5 years. The IMF yesterday counted 3,500 in industrial policy interventions globally. What all of this could mean is that huge subsidies are about to go into national champions or larger firms, which then leave through the back door to shareholders. And so, again, unless there is a redistribution story to go with this new growth economics, then inequality is going to get an awful lot worse. So in a way, these debates become even more important now in a world where we're having very different kinds of ideas about the future of growth. But ultimately, I'm not a populist because I think actually populism is the wrong way to describe them. I mean, I do describe them as not populists, but tribalists. And their political success is not, doesn't owe to whether they can bring people together, it's whether they can tear people apart. And crucially, what tribalists tend to do is launch a war on a nation's institutions, which ultimately are essential if we are to deliver the kinds of reforms that I hope for in the future. So ultimately, that's why I'm an optimist, not a tribalist. I'm still optimistic about the potential of progressive politics.
Well, I'm just glad he didn't ask you why you're not a liberal Democrat.
Well, I would then give you two different answers.
With reference to industrial policy, that economists have traditionally had an allergy to it because they think it's easily corrupted. In other words, that political interests will dominate the allocation of resources, and it becomes a mechanism for propping up inefficient industries. Do I think that the renaissance of thinking about industrial policy is challenged that effectively? Actually, I do. And there's not a serious debate that the hypothetical benefit of trade, it's more than hypothetical, the factual benefit of free trade and increasing the pie did not address the question of whether or not there's reductions for many people. And so I think that that's what Liam has been emphasizing, is that the failure was not the free trade, it was a failure of the free trade that was not coupled with efforts to make sure that these benefits were much more uniformly distributed. And so to me, what that says is industrial policies would be thought of as mechanisms that, roughly speaking, they slow down the rate at which you change so that you can sort of allow for smaller adjustment costs, et cetera. That I'm sympathetic to. I do think there's very good reasons to believe that, that many of the technologies that dominate the planet have so many network externalities, increasing returns to scale in them, that they don't fulfill the nice models that Adam Smith was thinking about in 1770 when he wrote The Wealth of Nations. I guess the other thing to say with respect to populism is that, well, actually, let me say one more thing about free trade. In my heart, I can never really get excited about limiting it because the fact of the matter is it had huge positive effects for the world. I mean, the end of poverty, the reductions of poverty in China and India, these are among the greatest achievements of the last half century, and so very uncomfortable in having discussions about turning off the dynamo that facilitated that. Now, there are different questions about when China is now an economic superpower, what the relation should be, but the counterfactual doesn't feel comfortable to me. I certainly reject the aspects of populism that have kind of a conspiracy view of the rich that are somehow, in some fashion, plotting things, et cetera. I think people in groups, they pursue self-interest, and so in that sense, I'm not sympathetic to some left populist rhetoric. And then I think that the final thing, what Liam said is absolutely important, and that is populism seems to be associated with tribalism. And that's a profoundly illiberal and I think not moral value.
Yeah. So I do think we're going to open it up for questions. You, Stephen, raised a point that I think is important to think about as we have these kinds of discussions, which is, especially when we talk about things like trade policy and industrial policy, but also maybe as we think about technology, is to what extent are there trade-offs that we need to consider as between inequality reduction at home and inequality exacerbation globally. That is to say that this discussion has been very focused on questions of what does the distribution of wealth or income look like in the United States or in the United Kingdom, which is one version of important inequality and one with particular importance for our domestic politics, et cetera. As of the moment. But there's also massive inequality globally, right? And so you can think about the inequality across rich nations and poor nations as another dimension of inequality which we might want to concern ourselves with. And I think it's worth thinking, at least as we talk about policy solutions to our internal inequality, to what extent do we face trade-offs with respect to global inequality? I don't know if you have further thoughts besides your already thoughts on trade.
So I think you can manage those trade-offs, but it does require you to actually start working multilaterally again. I mean, we're about to have a week of spring meetings in Washington next week with the IMF and the World Bank, and the truth is that much of the global South now confronts these 7 big giants that are blocking the road to delivering sustainable development goals. So want, hunger, debt, disease, conflict, climate change, lost learning. These are huge giants now blocking the path. And the reality is that the world is simply not doing enough to build the kind of multilateral institutions and finance the multilateral institutions that we're going to need to make progress there. And, I realize how difficult this is in Washington, but the reality is that Washington politicians have to confront, I think, is that if we don't want China to be the lender of last resort to many developing countries, then just carry on as we're going at the moment. Actually, if we do want agency, options, allies, then actually we need to think about renewing some of the Bretton Woods institutions that President Roosevelt helped create.
You can see ways in which it constrains even some of the things you talk about. So if you think about our recent adventures in trying to have a global minimum tax, right?
Yeah.
So if you think about the desire to change the tax regime at home, that might constrain poor countries' abilities to set that might be constrained by poor countries' ability to set their own tax policy in ways that attract capital or attract.
I think I'd argue it the other way, actually. I mean, the tax mobilization in most developing countries is, 10 to 15%. It's much too low to help deliver the kind of public safety nets and investment in infrastructure that is needed to accelerate development. And so by creating global minima, you actually take people out of the tax competition that does create a race to the bottom on tax policy. And so actually, I think if you've got global cooperation mechanisms, actually that can help rather than hinder.
All right, should we open it up? I think there's microphones and people can just raise their hands.
Thank you for your talk. My name is Anand. I'm a first-year MBB. I'm from India, so I really, it was a very thoughtful conversation. I really appreciate that. You gave the names and the examples of how inequality of wealth is such drastic in UK. It's also we also see that in the US. Coming from India, we see that how South Asian diaspora is growing rapidly, economically speaking, politically speaking as well. But we see individuals like the Hindujas in UK or the Mittals or Murtis. I mean, these are not just Indians. They come with their own wealth of social capital, their own wealth of cultural capital, which is inherently enshrined in structures of caste. So when they come up with that kind of a spider web of social cultural capital, there is no way that the black community here or the Mexican immigrant community here could be able to compete with them toe-to-toe. Because when you have that kind of an international foundation of cultural capital, that makes the important part of their wealth, not income. So how you see this part, a very important facet, a challenge for UK, because coming from India, we see that how this nexus of cultural and caste capital of upper caste Indians in US, in UK, in Europe, in India, is also a kind of a highway of populism, jingoistic nationalism. And what sort of a challenge, financial and political challenge, does it hold for West today? Because this diaspora is also rapidly becoming an ultimate political and cultural strategic backyard for ethno-nationalism in South Asia. So how you think about this threat? Thank you.
Fascinating. Yeah, thank you so much for the question. That is a fascinating perspective. And so the limits of the book explore what happens when you plug in countries that are very unequal, or where there is profound rent seeking, or even worse, profound corruption. What happens when you plug that in to a very open economy like the UK? And the most egregious example is the way in which Russian elites left Russia, having stolen fortunes in Russia, and laundered their money in London, and set up shop, and laundered their reputations, laundered the money, made huge donations to universities, the Royal Court in some cases, bought newspapers, funded think tanks, and there are now members of well-established Russian families in the House of Lords. And so the kind of spillover effects are something that I think we're only just beginning to get our head around. And about 60% of the world's billionaires, I think, are from the US, India, China, I think that's Russia. So we have to recognize that these kind of elites will move around and create negative spillovers in other countries too. And that is just another argument for kind of guarding political life in ways that are much stronger. So since Citizens United, you've had some pretty significant issues on big money in American politics, but we now have very similar problems in the UK. We have a huge fraction of the £1 billion that's come into British politics comes from about 10 individuals. But these individuals now are building ecosystems of influence, think tanks, TV channels, big party donations, membership of business councils that connect into government. And this is what modern rent-seeking looks like. And so it's going to get worse unless we do two things. One, create guardrails around politics which are much more strong and are much higher. But second, start addressing the fundamental of the inequality of wealth today. But you're absolutely right to say that in a globally interconnected world, elites in one country very quickly become elites in another country too, and that has a corrosive effect on both politics and economics.
The political side, I certainly wouldn't disagree with what you said. I think I do have disagreements on the economic side. In other words, that the total effect of immigrants in the United States has been this is not, it's incontrovertible, but it has been overwhelmingly positive for economic growth. That doesn't mean that there aren't contexts in which you get displacement of people, but the overall evidence of employment effects is weak. Certainly the effects the effects on creativity are massive. And I have a happy memory shortly after the end of the Soviet Union that the International Union of Mathematicians wrote the U.S. Trade Representative to complain there were so many Russian mathematicians in the United States, there was no jobs anymore. And I thought that was like the best thing imaginable. All these incredibly talented people came here. Okay, that's a cute anecdote. Look at the Nobel Prize winners that the United States has year after year after year, and what a fraction of them were born in other countries, or children of people that were born in other countries. So I think that it is inevitable that economic inequalities have the capacity for causing distributional instabilities in the political sphere, and that ought to be guarded against. But on the economic side, I'm very sympathetic to generous borders policies.
And I think it goes without saying that while we don't approve of ill-gotten gains, there is no better use of them than the support of universities.
It's a fine way to expiate sins. Expiating sins.
That's definitely worked for centuries.
Any questions?
So I want to go invite to think a bit forward, more than just like an accounting exercises of resharing taxes. So I would like to take, for example, Professor Durlauf's example that we have to fund schools, maybe fund each student by the same amount. And even if we do that, neighborhoods will sort. Maybe the richest individuals will go, even if the schools are public, they will have the best students because maybe those parents are more involved with their kids. And maybe it's going to be easier to teach, and then the professors, the best teachers, are also going to sort into those schools. And at the end of the day, even if each student gets the same amount of money, there will still be inequality. We can take, for example, UChicago. We have sorted here. We have Professor Durlauf, one of the best teachers possible, but this will still involve a process of inequality compared to others. So how could we think about this involvement as not just inequality as an accounting process, but also a more profound social interactions process?
Yeah. So we obviously have different challenges in, say, school finance to the United States. So we have a national system of school finance that delivers a much better equality of per pupil funding than you have in the United States. That's a good thing. But even our very, very unitary system still delivers whacking great differences in public spending per capita in, say, London than it does in inner city Birmingham or say, parts of the Northeast. So people like me propose quite a radical devolution of economic power and resource in the United Kingdom, but safeguarded by national rates of tax. And that's a very different challenge for America in such a federal system with such a devolved system of tax. But the issue is going to become more pronounced, right? Because if artificial intelligence is going to wipe out such a significant fraction of often quite routine jobs, then the way in which people aren't simply educated, but the way they're re-educated and retrained again over the course of their lives is going to become a much, much more significant determinant of how a country succeeds in the future. And, I was reading a speech by Jake Sullivan last night, who basically sets out the economics of American foreign policy today and basically comes down to two aspects of a solution. One is, are we going to invest in core strength? And are we, second, going to build a network of alliances globally? And if you think about the entrepreneurial genius that is the United States of America, and you think about how the revolution in primary and secondary education at the end of the 19th century helped propel that, there is a very significant challenge for the United States as to how it is going to invest in that core advantage by ensuring that every American citizen has an endowment that is good for the course of their lives, not simply a better equality of that endowment at the beginning of their lives. And I don't see those solutions in policy land in America. Maybe you'll tell me they're here. So I think in that regard, we're maybe in a slightly better position in the UK, but our bigger problem is just the kind of the underfunding of the education system, full stop.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, there's some discussion of universal basic income, but I think it is, in the political sense, relatively fringe. I'm not aware of any discussion of a sovereign wealth fund.
Yeah.
I think with reference to the specific question you asked, part of the answer I would give is we don't want the infeasibility of the ideal to be an argument against the good. And so what I would appeal to is the evidence we have that equalizations of school finance have had non-trivial effects on disadvantaged children. And it turns out that they become stronger when you interact them with early childhood investment. And so the work by Kirabo, Jackson, and Rucker Johnson, where they were looking at the interplay of improving school finance along with access to Head Start, is suggested that you can ameliorate these gaps. Now, I brought up the Head Start because that's actually an example where that does compensate for the differences between the parents. In other words, if middle-class families have the luxury, shall we say, of either being able to afford early childhood investment or it being done in home because only one of the parents is working. And so the existence of the public option in this case is, almost by definition, is going to equalize that playing field. And so I'm very sympathetic to the argument that there's a plethora of factors that are determining the differences in test scores among adolescents. But I do think that the best evidence now is that the school expenditures do play a role there, and equalization is efficacious.
I think this is a very important question, so I want to push on you a little bit to engage with it. So I think, so if you think about the theory of a university like this one, like why does a university like this one exist? Obviously an engine of inequality in important ways, right? An expenditure of massive amount of resources on a very small number of students. The theory has to be something like there are massive social returns to putting extraordinarily talented people in a room together and having them benefit from the complementarities of the peer effects and from the interaction with their professors, et cetera. And maybe we think we're at a point when we get to university where we have enough information we can do that, and maybe you want to say at the level of kindergarten we don't have enough information, and there's a line somewhere. And this is live here in Chicago right now, right? We're having a debate in Chicago about, within the city, how much money we should be spending on things like selective enrollment schools. Which are not targeted at people who can afford tuition, right? But they are targeted at the most gifted, intellectually gifted students. To put them in a room together, and the theory has to be something like there's massive complementarities, and that's worth an increase in inequality to get the complementarities. And so I'm just interested, like, how do we draw these lines? How do we think about those trade-offs? It's a very live policy question, I think, at the national level, but also we're talking about it in the city council.
Well, drawing the lines is, I don't know how exactly to do that, but let me make an affirmative argument for the existence of the University of Chicago. Okay. I think it comes down to obviously the social returns are number one, but I think there's something else, and that's what I'm going to call flourishing. In other words, one of the intrinsic goods in a society is that people fulfill their potential. And in other words, if you said to me that there's some responsibility variant of an injustice if Mozart goes to Juilliard versus me, my answer is, well, there's another injustice if he doesn't fulfill his potential because I can't play a piano to save my life. And so, again, I'm trying to say something to make light of a deep point, which is that if we talk about what the end goals of our society, it's flourishing. And inequality in that sense, we object to, I think, typically because it is inconsistent with flourishing. Now, you might say, what about all that deontological stuff I was saying? The reasons we object to it, I think, is because it's keeping people from having equal opportunities to flourish. And so that's why I think that, we have a plethora of institutions that do different things, absolutely is defensible. That said, a criticism one could make of the University of Chicago is that it doesn't have to be the bottleneck that it is in terms of delimiting opportunities. There's zero reason why the student body it can't be twice as large as it is today. The population of the world is increased. The number of highly educated, outstanding scientists is greater than ever. And so replicating this to scale, I don't think would be that hard. And so I have somewhat unkindly occasionally said, the world needs more Berkeleys, not more Chicagos. What I mean by that is Berkeley has 26,000 undergraduates, as correctly counted, I think just as many Nobel laureates as Chicago, and others people that work there. And you look at Fields medals and all that. But it created many more opportunities because it opened up the spigot, so to speak. And so I'm quite comfortable. And so, I actually believe in meritocracy, and that's why I use the phrase that deserves the name. And what I mean by that is a meritocracy that is social, prospective, and dynamics. Okay, I'm throwing a lot of terms out. A society that makes sure that children get all the opportunities to develop their talents, one that recognizes that each of us is interconnected, so I'm a role model, and so on and so forth, and so my value added as a member of a community has to account for those things. I think the idea that people get what they deserve, that if you define merit correctly and make it forward-looking, that I think that to me produces a very society I'm willing to argue very vehemently for. And I think a piece of it are these types of institutions. To give an extreme example of something I think is horrible are these proposals to reduce the teaching of mathematics in schools in California because you're getting disparities among high school seniors. That's leveling down. What I'm proposing, and I think this is what your book is proposing, is leveling up. And as corny as that may sound, I think that is a much more ethically defensible position.
Well, the only thing I would add, I mean, it's hard to add a better final word than that, but I mean, the only thing I would add is that I think that the challenge for education reformers today is genuinely, on the one hand, how do they build ladders that are better connected and deeper into a better diversity of communities? And that is going to involve some institutional links, which is where the idea of technical university trusts come from. But those ladders need to be much higher now, don't they? Because they need to sustain people on their travel up, hopefully, over the course of their lives. And second, they've got to be far better connected globally. Because actually, Gen Z, this extraordinary generation that is going to change the world, does think globally. And what we can't condemn them to is a one-off chance to pass or fail at the age of 18 to 22. What we have to try and sustain is what we have to try and build is a system that allows Gen Z to be genuinely global citizens and to explore, innovate, fail again, fail better, succeed, flourish over the course of the 21st century. And if we achieve that as education reformers, we'll have done a good thing.
All right. I think that's a good note to wrap up on. Please join me in thanking Steven and Liam for a stimulating conversation. Thank you.
I thought it went very well. And thanks to you. Thank you.
My pleasure. And I think you're welcome to join us upstairs for a reception, so please do.
Great.